Hello and welcome to Fit After 40. Today we're going to discuss the connection between mental health and physical health. Our guest today is a therapist, Andrew Beer, who he integrates mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy into the practice. He is a licensed therapist. And Andrew, welcome. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks so much, Chris. Doing pretty good. Yeah, not too bad. How about yourself, brother?
Oh, I'm good. Good, good.
Good.
So let's start with what got you into mental health? Why did you want to move into this space?
Yeah, that's a question with I was reflecting on this actually as I was just sitting down here to talk with you and kind of just going back in time to really when I was a teenager, honestly, and experienced a loss at an early age that, unbeknownst to me at the time, of course, would propel me into this path, which was I lost my father to cancer at the age of
Oh, wow.
13. And so, someone who I was very close to, kind of a rock in my family. And that process forced me to reckon with very difficult emotions, difficult mental states for a young person, and inevitably propelled me down the path of really struggling with mental health and honestly not getting the support I needed at that time.
Mm,
So that was a really, yeah, important factor in my own journey. And inevitably, what happened is, within a year, started using cannabis and and alcohol to kind of escape from the pain and the suffering that I didn't know how to deal with at the time. So that was kind of the beginning of that, and and eventually created a lifestyle that was somewhat sustainable, but not too sustainable long term.
right.
Playing in punk rock bands, playing in a touring band, bartending for many years, and just ended up in a lifestyle that was really centered around alcohol. Inevitable dependency on it, and over time found myself in a situation where I was in my early 30s where, both the drug and alcohol addiction had really consumed my life and was at a point where I was, um, yeah, had to admit myself to a hospital for almost an entire month to go
Wow.
through a safe detox from that. I tried to go to a rehabilitation program and they quickly realized that what I was going through was more severe than what they could handle. Was
Medical.
sent to an emergency room, went through a detox that was, obviously rough. They put me under for an entire week. Told me that I basically could have died from what I was going through if I didn't end up in a hospital at that time. So
Wow.
that was the real beginning of my mental health journey. You can
Ah,
imagine,
that
I was
sounds
30.
terrifying.
Yeah, it was. And, it was opiate and alcohol. And, crazy thing is I had pretty much been working a job up until a few months prior to that, was still kind of functioning under that, which I'm not alone. I know a lot of other people find
A
themselves in a
lot of
similar
people.
situation. So yeah, I came out of that hospital and realized like I need to find a different way to live. This is not it's clearly not sustainable.
Right.
And so coming out of that situation, I went up to Michigan for the detox, moved back down to Nashville after about 3 months once I was kind of stable. And in Nashville, where I was living at the time, found a great community, found a great connection through a meditation group, learned how to finally break free of just like patterns of craving that really went back to those young years, aversion to difficult emotions, and learned how to start dealing with my own mind finally. So that
Right.
was really the beginning of it, the impetus of that, and
Wow.
which would later propel me to go back to school, study psychology, pursue a master's degree. It was all kind of began there.
Wow. So, wow, there's a lot. I've got a lot of follow-up questions about that, but let's go back. Let's go back to kind of the beginning. You were a teenager. You were going through a lot of stuff that, frankly, teenagers are not typically equipped to go through, and you
Mm,
said you did not get the help you needed, and I think that's a common story.
mm.
And I think it's more common among men. So why do you think that you did not have access to the mental health resources that might have helped you? back then?
Yeah,
Do you think it was the stigma?
I'm sure stigma was part of it. And I think in my mind, like when I go back to being 13 years old, like it just wasn't even really on my radar, honestly. Like the idea of mental health, I think the awareness was a lot lower at that time. So
Yeah.
I think there was some stigma around it. And I think as a young teen too, it's just like there's this desire to just want things to be normal, and anything that's like
Sure.
weird or different from what your friends are doing at that age, it's yeah, it's just like I did do like a little bit of a group counseling at school that was definitely helpful, and it was other people in my high school who had lost parents, and so that was a little bit of group counseling, but definitely not on the level that I needed. And I think there's also this element that is common that I think a lot of people go through is like wanting to be okay for the other people in your family, of just
Right.
like, I don't want to be a burden on anyone else. So I just kind of got to suck it up and, be tough and get through this so that I don't, don't not be a burden on other
Right.
people. Yeah. So
Right.
those are a couple of the factors I think of why I
Sure.
didn't. Yeah.
Why do you think that stigma exists? If I break my arm and I have to go get my arm put in a cast, or if I need antibiotics and I tell my friends, I go out and go out to dinner, and I tell my friends, yeah, I broke my arm, I had to go to the hospital. Nobody says, nobody thinks that makes me weak, but there is that stigma with mental health, particularly among men. Wouldn't you say?
Hmm.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm glad you're bringing it up because I do think there's a huge, as I get into the field of mental health too, realize there's a huge disproportion of gendered in terms of who seeks out mental health. And I think a big part is definitely just like outdated ideas of what masculinity is and kind
Right.
of fixed ideas of being self-sufficient or um, not, that it's not a masculine thing to talk about how you're feeling or to talk about what you're going through. And I can handle myself. And then sometimes it's just like not prioritized in culture and like, yeah, in men's culture as much. Like priorities are like career or going to the gym or things like that. And like you
Right.
said, if you get an injury while you're working out, you go and get that taken care of. But if you suffer a loss or you go through a heartbreak in a relationship and you're spinning out and starting to drink more, people don't see that as like, oh, I should go see a mental health
Right.
professional. And that's a huge, luckily, we're at a time where that stigma is starting to change. And I'm glad you're bringing it up because I think it's really important to that this becomes more and more normalized. Like,
Absolutely.
look, yeah, it's important. And talking, believe it or not, can help.
And I do want to clear up one thing that I think you can probably help with as far as the definitions go. Growing up, alcoholism and chemical dependency were sort of presented as moral failings, or weakness of character. What does the medical literature say about that now? They don't really think of it that way anymore, do they?
Yeah, I think there's been a big shift, I mean, in terms of seeing it as what it is like a disease. It
It's a
is,
disease.
and working, and I've worked in the field of recovery too, where there's a lot of trying to shift the languaging around um, how we talk about addiction, and even using words like, especially around like opiate addiction, calling someone
Right.
a junkie or things like that, or a drunk, and trying to change the languaging. Like this is someone who's really suffering. They don't want to be caught in this pattern. They do so, and a huge part of it is predispositions, genetic
Hmm.
predisposition, and people.
Right.
It's not everybody who has these certain genes is going to fall into a pattern of alcoholism or a pattern of an opiate addiction, but the more and more studies that are done, the more they're seeing that there is a predisposition, and that for some people, when they, for example, drink alcohol for the first time, they have a very different experience to it that other people do. It makes them more alert, more energized, more
Right.
talkative, more social. Whereas some people have a few drinks and then start to taper off. It's harder for someone like that to get
Sure.
addicted to it because they don't have that experience where you have these other people who drink it, they're still awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it enlivens them. So there's a different interaction that happens there. Yeah.
by the same token, some people can eat whatever they want and maintain a healthy body weight, and some people really have to watch what they eat with a predisposition to heart disease or any other illness, right? I mean, it people have predispositions; they have to manage their health accordingly, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm glad you're, keep bringing it back to that, kind of health model too, because I think that's a really great way of framing mental health. And I'm glad it's starting to fall into that category. And I'm glad people can use their insurance and stuff to pay for it because it really comes
Absolutely.
down to, you know, do you want to be happy? You could have all your physical health, you could have all the material things you need, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be in a good mental state.
And if we look at the statistics, I really do. This gender disparity is I don't think we talk about it enough. Something like three-quarters of deaths of despair, as we call them, that is deaths from alcoholism, uh, opioid abuse, specifically drug abuse in general, and suicide kind of all go into this category. And it's overwhelmingly men. It's something like three-quarters of those deaths are men. Is that correct?
That sounds about right. Yeah, that does sound about right from what I've heard. Yep.
And it's do you think it's just because men are not seeking the help they need, whereas that stigma is not as powerful among women?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a big part of it, not seeking the help. And then it's like, why, again, are they not seeking the help? And I think oftentimes with men too, there's just this cultural orientation around being successful,
Hmm.
having to be succeed, whatever that means. I'm going to say that in quotation marks because it's such a relative thing. And this is something pretty personal for me. I've lost people, particularly friends I have and men to suicide. And when I think about, what they went through and how I didn't know what was going at the time, but in hindsight, what often happens is there's this cascade often of things that happen in life where things aren't working out the way they expected to.
Sure.
This is a big issue among young men at this time too. And a lot of the reason there's so much dissatisfaction of not finding a partner, not finding
Sure.
financial success. And then that becomes internalized into this form of self-hatred um, and isolation rather than that moment, seeing that as an opportunity for like, I could really use some help. I could really use some help in what I'm
Sure.
struggling with. And because that's less likely to happen for men, I think that's a big part of why you're seeing that higher suicide rate. And I also want to just mention here, like, there's this generational component thing that I think that often happens with men, where there's this handed down unintentionally maybe untended to mental health, fathers who have anger issues or don't tend to their own mental health, sons
Right.
who often pick that attitude up and see it as something that's not important. And I think what people can do is it's possible to break that generational thing, and you don't have to be someone who's advertising to everyone that they're in therapy either. But
Right.
we live in an age where you can just do telehealth, mental health from home. You
Sure.
can see your therapist. You don't even have to talk to other people about it if you don't want
Right.
to. And I think that's very slowly we're starting to see that. And I hope that starts to have an impact on these high rates of suicide among males.
And of course, therapists can't share anything. Everything is in confidence unless you're an imminent harm to yourself or imminent risk of harm to yourself or someone else, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and there's a reason, of course, for that confidentiality. Creates a safe space. And in probably my experience of working with therapists too, that's what a relief to have someone you can go and
Right.
talk to and just be fully open about whatever's going on in your mind. I realized like, God, I've never had this in my entire life before.
Right.
I've never done this before. Like really talk about what's actually going on in the depths and the corners, because there's this dichotomy between what I'm feeling and then how I feel like I maybe need to present myself to the world.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Something that comes up quite a bit too, I think, around male mental health is the fact that men don't have close friends.
Mm.
And as they age, they have less and less close friends, kind of starting basically at like, well, the latter being about 17, 18 years old. they start to lose friends, and then they don't have those close connections with friends. Do you deal much with that? And what are your thoughts about that and the need for men to have close friendships and close connections with other men?
Yeah, great. Really, really great point. And that is one of the first things I check in with people in a first session. What is your social circle like? Who are you spending time with on a regular basis? Are you getting time? If you're in a partnership, that's great. But then sometimes people put so much on their partner to be everything in their life. And having a solid social connection is so strongly correlated with mental health. And this goes way back in psychology too. Some of the early psychologists started to discover this. You think of people like, yeah, Adler, who is starting to realize that your mental health is not just about what's going inside of you, it's about your connection to your world. And if you feel like you're valued, if you feel like you're a part of a community and people look forward to seeing you, and especially in relation to suicidality, that's a huge preventative measure for suicide, is strong social supports. There was a study, I think it's the longest psychological study that's ever been done, and it was through Harvard, and it goes back, I think it'll expand 100 years, multiple
Wow.
generations. And they looked at a group of men. Of course, this is, all white men at that
Right.
time. Harvard, Harvard, people who went to Harvard, young
Right.
students at the time that they started with. But then they also took a group of really working class men from Boston as well as a part of the study. So they had these two groups, and they followed them for their lives and generations, and did all sorts of follow-ups in terms of physical, mental health, and how things are doing. And what they were really looking for is like, what is the key to happiness? And the interesting thing that they found is that, the key factor above all else was strength of social connections. And that relates to longevity, to physical health, to mental health. Those who felt that they were a part of solid friendships, where felt like they were valued, felt like they were a part of a community, had longer, meaningful, more happier lives. And I think that says so much to your point about why social connection is so important to mental health.
It really does. And if you've read the blue zones, these areas where people enjoy unusual longevity, one of the things they all have in common is strong community connections. And I think
Yeah.
that is critical. So you touched on this earlier, and I think that we should talk about what are the things that do actually legitimately make us happy. There's this image, particularly among American men, that that the fancy car, that the big house, that flying first class, that these are the things that will make you happy. If I just had a bigger sailboat, if whatever it is, and it's been referred to as the hedonic treadmill.
Hmm.
So maybe you could start by defining what the hedonic treadmill is and talk about does material stuff make us happier?
Yeah, it's such a good metaphor too, and I think I've heard it so many times that I'm come back to the image of a treadmill. And the thing about the treadmill is it doesn't stop going. That's the
Right.
whole, it's the whole idea for it. This is a treadmill that doesn't come to an end. It's not like walking to a destination. You stay on this treadmill, and the idea being, okay, if the mind has this orientation that if I get this thing I want, I will be happy. What happens when you get the thing you want? That orientation of the mind is still there, so it latches on to the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing, whether that's material things, whether that's um, relationships, whether that's, food, alcohol, whatever it is.
Right.
It becomes this endless cycle. And I mean, I also want to acknowledge there is some pleasure and some joy from getting a new thing, from getting a
Sure.
car, from getting in a relationship, right? Like all those things are real and good. But the important thing to recognize is that it's not going to completely fulfill you for the rest of your life. It's a temporary joy. It works for a moment, then it passes away. And then also to recognize that a degree of financial wellness is key to mental health, to
Sure.
having the, you talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of having the the foundation of that pyramid is things like food and safety. So, and we had talked about this, Chris, but then, there's a certain income level that like
Right.
will make you happy, but it's the perpetual following from more and more and more that, it's not like there's anything wrong with wanting to have pleasure and have good things in your life, but when the mind becomes fixated on it and attached to it and continually needs more and more,
Right.
there's this level of ups and downs that happen, and the mind doesn't find some degree of equanimity in life. And it's, one thing I tell people all the time is like, there's no way to get all pleasant all the time in your life.
Right.
Take it from someone who has tried it by various means. Like it doesn't work. It's a mental health is a process of balance. It's a process of, yeah, of course, enjoying those things that are beautiful and that bring you joy. At the same time, being willing to face what's difficult, to face what may be unpleasant, and orienting towards a mindset that is incorporates things like contentment, like
Hmm.
gratitude, and like I said, equanimity can help step off that treadmill, if you will.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you think that we have a society that has ever growing too much pleasantness, I guess you could say? A book I know Chris and I have both read, and a lot of my friends have, is A Comfort Crisis. And the
Mm,
idea behind that is we actually have a crisis of comfort, a crisis of too much stuff.
mm.
Uh, and we don't experience discomfort. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that humans in the United States right now in general should probably experience more discomfort so that they realize that it's not just this endless cycle of things that we kind of get ourselves trapped into?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it makes me just think of how, I'm just reflecting very personally of how overstimulated I can feel sometimes, with just consumption. I mean, even with things that are great, even like in wellness, right? Like, okay, wellness is a huge, huge market now, and there's so many great things offered from therapy to, meditative, to healthy foods and all of those things that are good. But then that can even become another trap of like constantly needing to fill myself with something that is pleasant or comfortable or going to take the edge off, as opposed to some degree of simplicity. When you say that, it makes me think of some of these people like the minimalists and people who are really into finding ways of being happy with like less things, needing less
Yeah.
stuff, having more space in a schedule. That's another huge thing of like not having to have every minute of every day filled up with becoming better, needing more, working towards buying the next thing. And so much of the most beautiful, meaningful moments can happen in those gaps. You know what I'm saying? Creating space to have a good conversation with a friend, sometimes a difficult conversation with a
Mhm.
friend, or in partnership even, having time where sitting down, and like you said, you mentioned discomfort, like, really strong relationships are the relationships that are able to have those uncomfortable situations, because what happens, both people come out of that with a better understanding of where their partners are at, even though it is uncomfortable. And I think the same thing goes for yeah, like busyness, or God, if I got to fill every break I have with consuming something while I'm eating and watching this and watching this, and break, I'm on my phone, right? Just taking that time to just have a little break, have a chance to drop in and see how it is you're actually feeling for a moment.
Right.
And we do have such a wide variety of things available to us too. Something I always think about is the fact that I used to drive around with a 18-inch by 18-inch book that had all the music I owned.
Mm.
That's right.
Yeah.
And now I live in a world where all the music I own is right here on this phone. Like I get whatever I want right here and it's on demand and it's there all the time. And I almost have like a overload of content to some degree. Uh,
Mm.
it's always available. And I feel a lot of times like I've got headphones on now. Obviously, it's because we're recording a podcast, but I have headphones on all day long, all the time. And I think a lot of people are just getting so much content now and it's so readily available that it's like sucking the meaning out of life in a lot of ways. And I think the readily available content we have, whether it be physical items or just audio content or visual content, is just overloading our minds. Is that something you run into in your practice?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. As a therapist, one of the first things I'll do at the beginning of sessions is offer people an opportunity for a brief meditation at the beginning of each sit where we both, our devices are off, our phones are off. And it's amazing because for me, it's like, oh, we're just spending 4 or 5 minutes. And people will tell me that's the first time I've done that. I don't remember the last time I've sat here for 5 minutes and done nothing, and allowing the nervous system to reset and find balance. I think we have a nervous system that knows how to find balance if we just give it the time and the space to do so. And I think to your point about the level of stimulation, it's really something I encourage people to bring awareness and, whoever's listening to this podcast too, when are those times you can really find for yourself where you just take a break from it, going for a walk without the headphones on, or whether maybe that is an intentional meditation to allow your mind to reset for a minute, allow yourself to whatever's maybe been sitting in the background or simmering under the surface to be felt, and to reorient towards that. So I definitely think it's a practice. And I also think because there's so many forces out there that are grasping for our attention, it takes some intentionality to like set boundaries. One of the things that I always do is from, 9:30 p.m. until 9:30 a.m. or whatever, like my phone is off. Like I give myself that little boundary before I go to bed and after I wake up, especially I think first thing in the morning, just how long can you give yourself an amount of time before you go for it right away?
Hmm.
And what does that do for your mind in the morning if you give yourself a little time just to wake up naturally?
Yeah. Kind of going off of that just a little bit on while we're on that topic and just kind of what you see in a practice like you have. What about anxiety? It seems like maybe people are just discovering anxiety for the first time, but it seems like there's more anxiety in the world we live in right now. And I think some of it stems from those types of activities and just the pace of things, the digital nature of everything we
Right.
do. Is anxiety a growing issue that you see, or is that just something I'm thinking?
No, yeah, you're spot on with that. And of course, particularly among young folks, this is like a big, big issue. Overconsumption of social media is hugely tied to the rise in anxiety, from the
Absolutely.
literature that I've read, and maybe, and I think part of that is it's almost too much for the human mind. We have to
Hmm.
remember we live in a human body that has evolved to live on the savannah or in nature, and things are evolving so fast now where it's like we are aware of everything everywhere, as the movie is, everything everywhere all at
All the
once, right?
time.
It's just
Mhm.
like, yeah, all the time. That's it. Yeah, and so that can be, I mean, it's like some of it is natural. If you're aware of everything that's happening in the world all the time, your body's gonna take that on, right? There's a sense of underlying fear and apprehension about what's gonna happen. There's also this comparing thing that is inevitable with social media consumption, where of course everyone presents their best foot forward, and then it's like easy to look at, okay, well, my like, god damn, and my highlight reel does not look as good as that person's highlight reel does, right? So there's this inevitable feeling of lack, and that contributes to anxiety as well. And then also, like you said, there's just maybe sometimes just the social connection piece again, not having the same quality or level of social connection if so much of it is only through digital,
Right.
through likes and
Mhm.
things, where it's a completely different experience when you're going on a hike with three of your best friends and you're, having a real conversation, and there's that co-regulation that happens in real life. And I think
Yeah.
there's less and less of that happening. There's also a decline in some of the social structures that used to happen. Like, I mean, I just think of bowling leagues or union halls or all these things that used to just be more common, where
Yeah.
people were
Yeah.
just out in their community more often. And I think we're seeing some of that coming back, and I'm encouraged by that. And it's taking different forms, whether it's like a yoga class or a softball league, or that's people are starting to realize like this is stuff that seems like it's recreation is actually foundational to my mental health and can
Yeah.
really help with things like anxiety.
That's good. Yeah. We have a running club, for instance. Chris is part of it, and that's what
Yeah,
we do. It's a bunch of guys. We get
Absolutely.
together a few times a week, and we just go running together, and it's probably 50% about the running and 50% or maybe even more about just the conversations we have while we're out there together.
I can
absolutely.
run by myself. I don't have to go with the club, but I prefer to go with the club for that
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
while we're talking about social media, and I do think that it is very anxiety provoking. A lot of social media has just become focused on recreational outrage. Why
Hmm.
why do you think that a post or a news article that is presented in a way that is designed to be triggering, why does that draw more engagement? Why can't we have something provocative that's positive, that's happy?
Hmm. Yeah, well, there's something called the negativity bias, which you may have heard of, where these emotions like anger, like rage, as you say, they are designed to hijack the human nervous system for a reason, right? Like that's a survival, again, back to the kind of evolutionary perspective. That's an adaptive mechanism for the mind. If someone is threatening your tribe, whatever 1,000 million years ago, that's an adaptive thing. For that rage comes right to the front, and it is the strongest emotion because it's a protective one. And so now let's fast forward to modern times, and you're seeing a post that, let's be honest, is probably not even that accurate, is designed to pull that out of you. And we have to keep in mind the people that are paid to do this, to create those posts, and even the people who have designed the social media platforms have done this in a way which they know how to intentionally, from everything. I mean, yeah, anyone who's seen The Social Dilemma knows some of these basics. Everything from the red notification buttons, the color red provokes, a strong response. And so, while I think most people want to feel good, um, it's easy to prey on people's frustration, resentments, and anger. And it might be a frustration about something else, but this post is the thing that's going to make them feel like, yes, it's because of this. Places the blame, maybe externally, gives a reason. Whereas something that's like maybe encouraging, it's sort of this, let's be real, there's some of that there's quite a bit of that too, but I know what you mean. It seems like the things that get the most traction and in beyond social media and the news as well, right, are the things
Sure.
that are devastating, atrocities, things to invoke anger or feeling. So, yeah,
Yeah.
why doesn't good news get more attention, right?
If it bleeds, it leads. That's what they
Yeah,
say.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
it's kind of a sad commentary on the human psyche. And to your other point about this kind of lifestyle envy provocation, they say comparison is the thief of joy. And I remember I was talking with a friend of mine and an old roommate, and he he was attending a party that was hosted on his sister-in-law's partner owned a yacht. And
Okay.
so they were at this yacht party, and he sat down in the stateroom of the yacht, and there was Yachting magazine sitting on the table, and he picked it up and was reading about this other yacht that had a movie theater, and he said, I looked around and I was like, why doesn't this yacht have a movie theater? It's kind of like, and, and,
Yeah.
and you could go forever, right? I mean, you could take that forever, and it's never going to make you happier to have a movie theater in your yacht, I don't think. But you mentioned mindfulness. I think that mindfulness meditation maybe is something we should talk more about. I started practicing myself a few years ago, and I found that during times where I am experiencing anxiety, it doesn't necessarily get rid of the anxiety, but maybe helps me contextualize it. But my experience aside, what is the purpose of mindfulness meditation? How does the practice work? Let's unpack it for those who don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say as a baseline, one of the things that mindfulness does is it turns towards your inner experience and your orientation to what's going around with you. And that becomes the place of practice. Rather than focusing on the external world, like you said, the circumstances, getting the next yacht, getting the bigger yacht, it turns toward the mind and looks very clearly at what's happening. And it's a practice of cultivating what is actually skillful and what is beneficial and an orientation that will lead to well-being. And I think at the baseline of it, it's a practice of seeing clearly, training the mind to see more clearly. I think it's really deeply tied to awareness, which is an innate capacity of every human being, right? Everyone has this awareness. And in mindfulness, what we're doing is we're really training to be at the depths of this awareness where beneath the judgment, beneath the expectations, there's this presence of mind that's already there. And in mindfulness training, is what we're doing is often dropping down through the layers of projections, of rumination, difficult feelings into this awareness, which is already there. And through collecting the mind, through like placing the attention on the breath, right? This is one of the most, common instructions you get in a mindfulness practice. You use an object so that helps stabilize the mind. And what it does is it starts to draw out a certain clarity where, okay, I can be feeling this emotion. And rather than being in this fear or apprehension or whatever it is that's connected to the anxiety, I can be aware this is just a feeling. This is there's an experience in the body, there's some racing of thoughts. It's not who or what I am. Just like everything else, it can arise and pass. And so the more we practice in something like that, the stronger that its capacity gets. And it's just like going to the gym. The more time you spend watching thoughts arise and pass, developing a stronger presence of mind, it helps enhance a greater discernment. And what that can do is lead to a greater sense of wisdom in terms of when I'm not caught in the rumination, when I'm not caught in the self judgments, can I see clearly the direction that I want to go? And often in my experience, I've found that I can be so lost or caught up in something that I've been whirling in and thinking about for weeks, and then have a moment where I just finally sit down and just let it settle and come out of it for a minute, actually, and let it settle down, and then have a completely different perspective because I'm not wrapped up in it. And so that's one of the main ways I think mindfulness can be really effective. It's just even just collecting the mind in a basic way and allowing for some greater clarity and discernment.
It's interesting how much of our time we're spent just reacting, and
Mm,
it does take a deliberate effort to turn consciousness on itself, which I think is a fair definition of mindfulness.
mhm.
Now, you lead mindfulness retreats, is that correct?
Yeah, I lead a group. I lead a weekly
A group.
mindfulness group here. Yeah, and I'm also a part of a group in Nashville called Wild Heart Meditation Center, and I lead a Wild Heart group here in Detroit. And that was a meditation center that I had kind of found in my early recovery, and kind of learning to sit and practice was essential for my recovery. And it also kind of sent me on this journey of sitting a lot of retreats.
Mhm.
And I can talk about that a little bit, but I
Absolutely.
found that to be deeply healing. And I had become interested, obviously, because I realized, there's a key moment maybe that I'll mention where I was still relapsing in my early addiction. It took me about
Mhm.
7 or 8 months to finally stop going back to the thing that had literally nearly just killed me, like
And that's not
the my
uncommon.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
not
think.
uncommon at all. Yeah, and your brain chemistry at that point is so maladapted, and it just takes time to recover, and that's the
Sure.
hardest time, right? Is that first year. But I had a moment where what I started to do is when the craving would come on, if I was getting home from work or something like that, I ins what I learned to do was just to sit on the meditation cushion,
Right.
watch my breath, and what I and sit through and feel the whole craving, and then watch it subside and realize this is just a temporary thing, you know? It's like this thing that I had been following for so long and felt so compulsive and like I had to was just this temporary thing that would come and go. And that was like a really profound experience and led to a deep letting go. And so I started going on like a weekend retreat out to Joshua Tree with a group at the time,
Cool.
and then a week long retreat. And I started realizing when I would leave these retreats, and I remember like going into the airport with a friend afterwards, and we're waiting for our luggage, and we both had this moment where we looked at each other and we both started laughing because we're like, wow, like the my mind feels it's almost like an altered state.
Mhm.
There's this book called Altered States, Altered Traits, and it talks about how practicing mindfulness over time leads to permanent changes in the mind where
Right.
there's a greater capacity for just this fullness of presence that felt so refreshing. I felt like I was really fully there. I didn't have some of my classic preoccupations or apprehensions or self-judgments in those moments. And so that propelled me forward, and I ended up traveling to Southeast Asia. And I've now spent, I would say, the last 6 or 7 years, I've taken 1.5 to 2 months out of each year to spend on silent retreat, whether that's at a monastery in Southeast Asia or at a retreat center here in the US. And what I found in those longer retreats, one of the things that I'll draw out is like I talked about, giving the nervous system time to reset. If you sit still for a week, for 2 weeks, whatever hasn't been felt, I can guarantee you the body will start to bring it up. And
Hmm.
so sitting on those longer retreats, what it did is it gave me an opportunity to really process deeper into the nervous system. And I think really ultimately one of the first retreats I went on, the longer ones I went, it was in Myanmar. This is years and years back. And so much fear came up, weeks and weeks of fear and not knowing why it was coming. And then finally one night, just sitting in bed, kind of exhausted from the practice, and just like I kind of asked, like, just like out loud, like, what do you want from me? Like, I don't, what else do I need to do? And it was something about opening up that question. And I finally felt this huge wave of grief that came through. And it was like probably something that went all the way back to these younger years of losing my father, something that I had pushed so deep down and just hadn't allowed myself to feel. And I think there's something about any kind of a mind body practice, and I don't think it's just meditation, where you allow your mind to really have time to resettle into the nervous system. And I don't think anyone makes it through this life without some degree of some emotion or something that hasn't been felt that needs to be processed. So I think meditation, daily practice, or retreats can be a great way to start.
It's observing your thoughts is a very different experience than trying to put them on mute with a cocktail or a shopping excursion, whatever you're using for your thing.
Right.
Um, Although I think obviously we can agree that alcohol is one of the more damaging escapes that people use. Anymore, even if I only have one or two drinks, I find that it disrupts my sleep. I find that it delays recovery from training. I find that it does not have a positive effect on my mental state. What does alcohol do to the brain?
Yeah, well, there's one of the main things it does is it releases some of the inhibitory responses of the brain, particularly GABA is the most well-known one. And what that does is it causes uh, the process of relaxation or the kind of, this is one of the reasons why people will suddenly say things that they weren't going to say,
Right.
right? It works on the prefrontal cortex and it has this inhibitory response, which, yeah, lessens that for the time being. And that's the key thing, right? So you have this process where it has this temporary relief. And then what it does is it modulates the production of neurotransmitters over time. So what and it inevitably does is it disrupts the body's innate capacity to release things like GABA and cortisol. And over time, what does it do? What it does is, unfortunately, decreases one's capacity to deal with stress.
Hmm.
So, particularly, cortisol plays a big role in that.
The stress
Increased,
hormone.
yeah, exactly. So, increased baseline levels of cortisol are one of the main functions of regular alcohol use. And that's not even alcoholic levels of alcohol use. I'm talking about even regular, couple days a week, things like that. What it does
Right.
is it decreases the mind and the body's capacity to deal with stress successfully and skillfully. And so over time, when that person has that drink, it has an even more of a relief. It has even more of a release because they're finally getting a break from the stress.
Right.
And so it's, again, like you use that treadmill image, really, it's another step back
It's
onto the
applicable.
treadmill in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Applicable to this as well. So to make sure I understand correctly, you feel like it's relieving the anxiety, but it's actually increasing your baseline anxiety and creating, at the risk of overusing the word dependence, creating a dependency type of scenario where you rely on it to get that anxiety back down.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It does that. And it's also a mood disruptor too, it has a huge impact on things like depression. You mentioned anxiety. It's going to disrupt your body's natural ability to process emotions. It can lead to even like shrinkage in the brain,
Hmm.
things that I don't think are talked about enough. Um, yeah, and what that does is it classically makes people more on edge. It's often why people need to feel like they need to have a drink before they have a difficult conversation or something like that, or to, you name it, get on stage, perform, because it takes that some kind of an edge off. But unfortunately, what it does is it, can become for some people addictive and dependent. And it's, of course, it's possible to have a healthy relationship to it, but I think it's
Sure.
important for people to just be aware of what some of the consequences are, and maybe that can help them inform how they use it.
Absolutely. I
Mm,
used to I used to always have a couple of drinks before I did any type of public speaking, and it became kind of a crutch in that
mm,
regard.
mm,
And alcohol also has some pretty deleterious physical effects. It is actually a higher concentration of energy than even simple sugars, so it can
mm,
disrupt metabolism in a
Mhm.
way that even more so than sugar, and a lot of bad health effects. I think that a lot of researchers are coming to the conclusion that there really is no safe amount of alcohol consumption, or there is no consequence-free amount of health. I'm not saying you shouldn't
exactly.
have one, but
Yeah.
beyond that, you really aren't doing yourself any favors.
Yeah. And then, I mean, maybe on an encouraging point too, just to say that, like, the body has an incredible capacity to come back and to rebuild if you give it the time, like, I mean, early in my recovery, I had this kind of thought, like, a lifetime. I don't know if I can go a whole lifetime without drinking, but I know for a fact I could probably use 5 years without it. That was the goal I set. And I know it's kind of abnormal. Most people say never can, never will do it again. But that was what I said for myself. And I was like, and then I'll see how I feel then. And sure enough, gave myself 5 years, never felt like I really wanted to.
I was about
I
to
was
say,
like,
how,
wow.
how do you feel 5 years down the road?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, that along with so many other things. But I think seeing how the body and the mind can bounce back over time if you just give it the space. Like, we have this incredible the human body has it's so incredibly resilient if we just create the circumstances and in the environment for it to heal. So yeah, just also that encouragement, and for people to try it out. I know a month can be great, but what would it be like if you gave yourself a whole year? How would that
Sure,
feel, just as an experiment? And yeah, again, I'm not going to hear and condone and say no one should ever have alcohol again, but it's
sure.
it's good to just have the knowledge of and see what works for you.
On the topic of alcohol, I feel like that message is catching on, and I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but like there seems to be a feeling about I think that people are using less alcohol now, and I don't know if that comes out in the math or not, but it was kind of a funny anecdote. Is the other day a friend of mine who's a DA, they wanted to do some testing on people to see how they respond to alcohol. It was the police department was going to do it, and so he's like, "Hey Tony, you want to do that?" And I was like, "I don't drink anymore." He's like, "Jack, you set the standard. You're cool. You don't drink. Nobody drinks anymore." And he had trouble
Mm,
finding somebody to do it. And I think that's kind of
Hmm.
interesting that we are starting to, I think, see that. And that combined with every now and then I do see the occasional person about my age that's dying of liver failure. So, there's still
Sure.
a lot of that out there. But I feel like there's a movement about to kind of decrease the use of alcohol. I don't know if that's something anyone else has noticed or might be mindless babble. I don't know.
Well, but we do have a strong cultural affinity toward grabbing a cocktail. And for a lot of people, that social change could be the challenging part. And I mean, Andrew, when you and I met, I think that probably a majority of our conversations were conducted with drink in hand that first year. So maybe you can talk to resetting your social what am I trying to say
Yeah.
here? Resetting your social activities. How do you engage people? How do you make that change in terms of a practicable lifestyle choice?
No, it's a great
yeah,
idea.
yeah, definitely. Great topic, because I think that seems to be one of the hugest obstacles for people. And I remember for myself even having this thought of like, I'm just going to be a loser from now on. It's like
Right.
everything cool that happens in a bar. I'm in a rock band. I'm a bartender. I can't do any of that anymore, is where my mind went. And I think not being a bartender anymore was a great idea. And I'm glad
It's
I stuck
okay.
with that. Yeah, getting out of that scene and environment. But I continue to play shows with my band. In fact, played quite a bit better, played quite a bit better in those shows with my band. And I continue to play. I mean, and I don't play as much as I used to, but I don't think anyone has to equate stopping drinking without living in a meaningful life. And a huge thing is just like, how can you get social interaction in just a different way? We talked earlier about things like running clubs or getting a yoga group or whatever feels meaningful. I got really into food, and just like really enjoying
Yeah.
going out and enjoying a great meal. I got really into enjoying other beverages, a great cup of coffee. I'm still a big coffee aficionado, going out for coffee and switching my social routine where most of my social events were either kind of during the day or in the morning or going out for dinner. I wasn't really staying out past, I mean, I still don't really stay out
Right.
much past. I mean, I'm also 40 years old now, so that's part of it too. But
Makes a difference.
yeah, and I think there's a lot of ways to do it. And I think one of the things is like what can you fall in love with? What can you enjoy that's outside of that? And for me, that a big part of that, especially in my early years, was exercising was a huge part of that. I know you guys
Sure.
are into running. It's a great way. It's a natural way to get high. It's especially if you do it with your friends. And like I was saying, yoga groups are great. Um, yeah, and just finding a kind of balanced new routine where you don't feel like you're going to be some hermit, because I think that's what a lot of people often do in their dry months is they just cut off their social connections for the month and then they come back to drinking without really
Yeah.
using that opportunity of like, how can I find different ways to connect to people socially?
They're not really reevaluating their life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you find something you love more, like one reason I don't drink anymore is because I like to run, like you said, and I love that more than I like that. So, and a few drinks and the next day shot. So you got a bad run the next day and everything's horrible and then it just continually it's a cycle. So, you have to make decisions. So if you found something you love more, it's easier, be like, okay, I'm going to prioritize this thing I love more than drinking and
Mm.
shift your life to that.
Yeah, great point. That was I was a recovery coach for a while, and that was one of the first things I would focus with people on is not so much all the negative, but like, what is it that you love? How can you focus that on a way where it becomes so important to you that you stop thinking about drinking because you're so focused on, whatever that is, your career, you're learning, taking on an education, becoming a runner, it doesn't have to cost you a ton of money. There's plenty of ways you can do that that's affordable, and find a passion and take that all the energy you're putting into drinking into something that's actually gonna benefit you in the long term.
Also, did you notice what your dinner tab looked like when there weren't a bunch of drinks on it? So
Yeah, speaking of
maybe you
money,
can actually
absolutely.
spend a bunch of money
Yeah.
on a new hobby, depending on what you were spending on alcohol.
Yeah, you'll be able
Um,
to afford that gym membership or whatever it
that's
is you
right,
want.
absolutely. So, Andrews, let's say somebody is wanting to engage a mental health professional, or maybe they want to go on a mindfulness retreat. Can you point us to some resources?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. In terms of mental health professional, I mean, I know you're living in a different state. You have a certain type of insurance. One thing I always recommend is just checking out Psychology Today is a great place to start. You can find a therapist in your area that will take your insurance that you can connect with. And then in terms of mindfulness, or if you're interested in meditation, obviously there's just so many great apps out there or places that you can
Sure.
start, so that's a great way. And then I mean, the kind of community that I came from is called it's popularly known as kind of like insight meditation. There's a really great retreat centers in the United States. You've got what's called Insight Meditation Society on the East Coast. You've got Spirit Rock on the West Coast. And then, of course, some self promotion. We've got Wild Heart here.
Yeah.
Wild Heart has a great center in Nashville. I'm starting a Wild Heart community here in Detroit, which is in a
Oh,
similar
wow.
tradition. It's a way of kind of taking some of the principles from Buddhist meditation and making it really easy and accessible for
That's right.
everyone to practice. Yeah.
That's
So
right.
those are just off the top of my head, but happy to share more with you, and maybe you can put them in the notes if anyone's interested.
Absolutely. We can
Absolutely.
we can put a bunch of the stuff in the blog for those that are interested. We'll have a blog post ready here shortly. So, and if
Awesome.
somebody does want to find you and talk about the mental health services that you provide, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I will share. I have a work phone number, and I will pick it up, and I have an email as well, and so I will share that with you as well. I mean, my email is andrewbeer.detroit@gmail. Please, if anyone's interested, I do even offer, like, obviously it's not like formal therapy where it bills insurance, but I offer like coaching and mental health services as well, on my own. So if anyone's interested, please just reach out, even if it's just a chat, or if what I said brought up anything from them. I'm always love hearing from people.
Wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. I think this is such important information, and I don't think it gets shared enough. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks
Thank you very
for
much.
allowing the time. Thanks to you guys for what you're doing on the podcast, and just helping promote this, yeah, mental health awareness. Appreciate it.